We're now on Daf Lamed Gimel of Beis, and we're studying the Shita of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir holds a kol aton bias mayim midivrei sofrim. Whenever the Rabbanon established tuma, meaning on a biblical level, it's not tameh, but the Rabbanon would gozer tuma, maybe because they were afraid in a certain case that if you don't treat it as tameh, like for example, if you don't treat your yidayim as tmeos, then maybe you'll come in contact with truma, which is obviously awesome in a Torah. But in any event, the general rule is, according to Rabbi Meir, that anything that midrabanan is tameh is mitame es hakodesh uposel es truma. So far, so good. Rabbi Meir is just applying the dinim of Tumah Doraisa to Tumah Dorabanan, and Tumah Doraisa, when you have, let's say, a Sheni L'Tumah, it could passel Truma or Kodesh as a Shlishi, meaning there's something called a Shlishi with regard to Kodesh and Truma. But a Muta B'chulin Masa, Masa here is referring to Masa Sheni. So again, the fact that he says Muta B'chulin is very understandable, because what are you going to say? The Sheni Midrabana now passes on the contamination to Chullin. Chullin, there's no such thing as Chullin Shlishi. Well, what's Chullin Shlishi? However, here Rabbi Meir goes one step further and he equates Maser with Chullin. So that if you have something that's Tameh as a Sheni L'Tumah Midrabanan, we don't mind, according to Rabbi Meir, if it comes in contact with Maser Sheni, because Maser Sheni is somehow a lower level of Kedusha, and we equate it with Chullin. Divrei Rabbi Meir. Chachamim osrim b'maser. Although the Chacham certainly grant Rabbi Meir's premise that a Sheni L'Tumah D'Rabbanan can't make a Shlishi of Chullin, but as far as Maser is concerned, Chachamim elevated Maser and equated it with Kodesh and with Truma, such that Midrabanan, now the Maser will become Shlishi L'Tumah. And again, we're talking about Maser Sheni, which is Kodesh. And for all intents and purposes, according to Chachamim, it has the same status as all of Kodesh. And therefore, if you use, let's say, Shnios would be in unclean hands to come in contact with Maser Sheni, that's prohibited. Because a Sheni L'Tumah could be Metame, according to the Chachamim, even Maser Sheni. And again, all this is reflective of the premise that Maser Sheni and anything that anything that was purchased with Kesef, Pidyon, or Maser Sheni has the same status as Maser Sheni. So wait a minute, let's just make a pause here. Where we hold it? Make sure we have the cheshbon here. Yeah, we had Rav Nachman, who said that we're dealing with Kesef Maser Sheni and Chullin, which means the meat of this shechita was purchased with Kesef Maser Sheni, and it has the same status as Maser Sheni, and therefore you're not allowed to touch it with a Sheni L'Tumah, which is Yadayim Mesuavos. And that's what we have here, that it works out beautifully according to the Chacham. Maskifle Rav Shimi Bar Ashi Mimai. You're assuming that, according to the Chachamim of Rabbi Meir that we just learned about, there is Right. There's an isur of coming in contact with your of Yadayim Shniyos coming in contact with meat that was born with Kesef Masasheni, and that's also according to Chachamim. Who said so? Dilma. Ad kan lo pligi Rabbanan aled Rabbi Meir. The Rabbanan accept Rabbi Meir's basic premise that as far as Negia be Ochel Hanilkach bekesef pigeon shel Masasheni, there's no Isa. Mutter b'masa, like Rabbi Meir. Ad kan lo pligi Rabbanan. When do the Rabbanan argue with Rabbi Meir? They're more machmir, and they don't accept Rabbi Meir's leniency. Ela b'achilas maseh. They're not willing to go as far as Rabbi Meir to permit you to eat maser that was handled by shnios. Again, there is no maser here, but we're talking about the meat that was bought with kesef pigeon of maser, which has the same status as maser sheni. Al benegia of the maser v'achila b'chulin lo pligi. The Rabbanan never rejected the heter and the leniency of Rabbi Meir regarding the Giyah b'maser. And v'hanegiyah, our Mishnah is talking about, whether you're permitted, because there was no dam, to come in contact, your hands come in contact with the meat. Why should, right, implying that if there was dam and it was muksha, then it would be asur. Why is that so? Even the Rabbanan of Rabbi Meir would allow you to have contact with it. Midik toni nechol v'yadayim v'soavos. Since the Mishnah mentions that in the case where there's no dam and it's not muksher, then you're allowed to eat it with yadayim v'soavos. Now, what does necholim mean in the word necholim? Necholim could mean that somebody else puts it into your mouth. Milo askina de kosafile chavre, which means that because there was no dam that came out of the shechita, the meat was not muksel kabel tuma, and therefore you could feed the meat with unclean hands to somebody else. Implying that if the dam did come out and the meat was there for muksel kabel tuma, then a person with unclean hands would not be allowed to feed you the meat, because now he's come in contact shnios with meat. But now we're saying that as far as Negia is concerned, even the Rabbanan agree that there's no Negia, there's no problem or Isser of Negia. Elomar of Papa, now we have to come up with a different interpretation of our Mishnah. Wow. This is brand new in the world of Kodshim. In the constellation of Kodshim, what we know about is that Yadayim max out at Shnios, right? Because the Yadayim came in contact with something Tomei. Now we're saying, according to Rav Papa, the Yadayim themselves are Rishon, or in plural, Rishonos. Now we'll soon see that the case of Yadayim becoming Rishonos is a case of Beis HaMenuga. That if your body goes into the Beis HaMenuga, you become Tomei. According to Torah law, again, we'll see this in a minute, Bia b'mixas lav shmei bia, if only your hands go into the Beis HaMenuga, there's no Tumah at all. But the Rabbanan will go there Tumah in the case where his hands went into the house. Otu, they're afraid that maybe if you tell him his tar, when the hands went in, he'll come to the conclusion that even if his whole body went in, he would remain tar. And Reb Shimon Elazar, and we're going to learn now a brisa that quotes Reb Shimon Elazar, who's going to tell us that there's something called Yodayim Rishonos. So the brisa first opens up with the shita of I guess the Tanakama. The Sanya en Yadayim Tchilos L'chulin. Right? You can't call Yadayim Tchila, meaning Rishon L'tumah. Again, even though we're dealing with the Chachamim here, but there are cases where even the Chachamim will agree that it's a Rishon L'tumah. That's a separate din in Kodesh and in Truma. We're now discussing Chula. Is Reb Shimon Elazar Omer Yod Mishum Rabbi Meir Yodayim Tchilas L'chulin. Wow, that Yodayim could become Rishonos. And therefore, if those Yodayim, which we'll soon describe when he put them into Beis HaMenuga, now come in contact with Chullin, they make the Chullin to Sheni L'tumah, which, as we said before, Chullin can max out at Sheni L'tumah. Ushnios L'truma. Now, this Shnios L'truma makes no sense, as the Gemara is going to write just a little bit of a bracketed digression, because we can't understand the way it's formulated here. Tchilos l'chulin in l'truma lo. I mean, truma is always more machmir, and the laws of Tumah V'Tara are so much more strict than they are in chulin. How can you tell me that, as far as chulin is concerned, the Yadayim have the status of rishonos, but as far as truma is concerned, they only have the lower level Tumah of shnios? No, hachikom. We have to rewrite the text. Tchilos af l'chulin. Shnios l'truma in l'chulin lo. Meaning that if Yadayim are shnios, that's only relevant to truma, and Yadayim shnios are prohibited from coming in contact with truma, because truma becomes a shlishi l'tumah, and therefore you pass the truma. But as far as shnios is concerned, there's no relationship between shnios and chulin. But tchilos, if you have a case of Yadayim that are tchilos, rishonos l'chulin, then even with regard to chulin, there's a problem here, because the chulin, when they came in contact with Yadayim rishonos, again we'll see what rishonos is, then the chulin becomes sheni l'tumah. So now we go back to our Mishnah. Our Mishnah implies that if there was dam on the meat as a result of the shechita, then the meat is mukshel l'kabel tuma, and now you're not allowed to touch it with Yadayim misuavos. But now we're going to reinterpret misuavos to mean rishonos, and reflecting the shita of Shimon ben Elazar. Umika Yadayim tchiyum. What is this case of Yadayim that become, according to Reb Shimon, Rishonos? Actually, it's Rabbi Akiva, but Rabbi Shimon accepts Rabbi Akiva. The Snan, we learned in the Mishnah, where is this? In Yadayim, Masechta Yadayim, Hichnis Yadav Lebeis Hamenuga Yadav Tchilos, the Rabbi Akiva Chacham Omrim Yadayim Shnios. So we said the following, that Rabbi Akiva has a gzera, that even though you only put your hands into the Beis Hamenuga, but had you put your whole body in, you would contaminate your whole body. Therefore, for that gzera reason, Rabbi Akiva established that even the Yodayim that exclusively entered into the Beis Hamenuga without the rest of his body, never they're tmeos, and those are called rishonos. Why? Because if his whole body went into the Beis Hamenuga, that would be a rishon l'tumah. And we're going to treat the Yadayim when they go in alone as if the whole body went in. And therefore it's a Rishon L'Tumah. Chacham Omrim no. Yadav Shnios. So in a minute, the Gemara is going to ask, so why did you have to introduce here Reb Shimon ben Elazar? Why don't you just mention Rabbi Kiva? Oh, we'll get to that. Oh, so now the Gemara explains the Machlokas in the Mishnah Yadayim, the Kuli Alma Bia B'Mitzvahs Lo Shmei Bia. So on a Torah level, unless you go in the whole body into the house, you're not Tameh. But the Rabbanon instituted a new Tumah. And why did they institute this Tumah if only his hands went into the base of Nuga B'Gzeri Yadav Atu Gufo Kamifligi? And now we have Machlokes between Rabbi Akiva and the Chacham. Mar Sover, according to Rabbi Akiva, Sa Yadav Ki Gufo. Why not? If the Gzeri is Atu Gufo, then the Yadayim should have the same identical status as Gufo. Shavina Rabbana made it into Gufo, and therefore becomes a Rishon L'Tumah, just like if his whole body went into the base of Nuga, he's a Rishon L'Tumah. Mar Sabur the Chachamim hold. Yodayim ki Yodayim di Alma Shavina Rabbanon. Just like as a general rule, the Rabbanon made a Gzera that Yodayim, unless they're clean, are considered like Shnios L'Tumah. So too, in the case of Yodayim that entered into the base of Nuga, the Rabbanon considered it, even though in Torah it's not Tomei at all, they consider it like Shnios. So why are you introducing here Reb Shimon ben Elazar? After all, Rabbi Akiva goes on record as saying the Amar Yadayim Tchilos Havavyan. So if you want to introduce a pshat in the Mishnah based on Tchilos, then why not just suffice it with Rabbi Akiva? And the Gemara answers Dilba Ki Kam Rabbi Akiva Ani Milu B'Truma V'Kodshim Techamiri, where the laws of Tumah V'Tara are that much more strict in Truma and Kodshim. And that's where Rabbi Akiva elevated the status of the Yadayim that went into the Beis HaMenuga and gave it the status of a Rishon L'Tumah, so that now a Rishon L'Tumah will be Metame, Kodesh, and Truma. But as far as Chullin is concerned, Chulin, Shnios Havyon. Maybe Rabbi Akiva would maintain that as far as Chullin is concerned, where there's no special chumrah of taros, of tum v'tara, then let's leave it, like we said in the Chachamim, like Yodayim in general, which Yodayim in general are only Shnios. Therefore, if we want to understand our Mishnah, we're going to introduce Rav Shimon ben Elazar, who says Mefurish Lehedja that the Yadayim become Rishonos even as far as Chullin is concerned. So now the Gemara says the following. Okay, you couldn't introduce Rabbi Akiva because Rabbi Akiva might hold, as far as Chullin is concerned, that these Yadayim have the status of Shnios. Lehavinami Shnios. I couldn't care less. Even if I grant you that the Yadayim are only Shnios, nevertheless, we have Rabbi Akiva's Shita, which is a mind-boggling Shita, that Chullin could become a Shlishi L'Tumah. Who ever heard of such a thing? We learned in the Mishnah in Sota, because the Mishnah in Sota is talking about that very day in which they deposed Rabbi Elazar. No, 1 second. They deposed Rabbi Yeshua. 1 second. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Starting it. They deposed Rabbi Gamliel, and Rabbi Gamliel was very careful. He wouldn't let students into the base medrash unless they were A++. And then he got replaced by whom? By Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Once Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was the Nasi, was appointed as the replacement Nasi, they allowed all the Talmidim to come to the base medrash. And on that day, there was so much Torah learning. They were machadish many new dinim. That's called Bo Bayom. And Darash Rabbi Akiva, and one of the dinim was Rabbi Akiva's din, based on a drasha with regard to clay cheres. And what does it say in the parsha clay cheres? It says klal clay cheres yitma. Right, there's something called avir atum sheretz is hanging like a puppet inside the airspace of an earthenware. Anything in the earthenware becomes tamei. And yet, says Rabbi Kiva, look carefully at the pasuk. It says Yitma, Tame lo nema. Why doesn't it say Tame? It should say Kol Asher Bakli Tame. But Yitma. So what does Yitma mean? Letame Acherim. It means that anything that was inside the earthenware, when the sheretz came into the airspace of the earthenware, not only does it contract tuma, but it also conveys tuma. L'tamei acherim. That's how Rabbi Kiva learns it. Limit al kikar sheni. If inside the earthenware there's a kikar that has the status of a sheni l'tuma. And why is it a sheni l'tuma? Because it was inside the earthenware vessel when the sheretz fell in. And now, who ose, the Torah wants to mechadish that it can convey tuma shlishi to Chullin, because the pasuk is talking about Chullin. No indication that we're talking about Kodesh. So therefore, you and Medai can have Mishnah that if the dam would have come out of the shchita onto the basar, it's mukhshel kabel tuma, and therefore you can't touch it with yadayim shnios, yadayim soivos. The answer is we're going according to Rabbi Akiva, who holds that Chullin could become a shlishi l'tuma, that a sheni could impart, but through contact with Chullin could transform the status of the Chullin to shlishi l'tuma. And then you're not allowed to eat it, because if you eat it, you become Tomei, and you're not allowed to become Tomei. So once again, why do we have to introduce Reb Shimon ben Elazar? Just suffice it with Rabbi Akiva. Dilma, the Gemara says, Hani mili b'tumah doraisa. When did Rabbi Akiva say that a sheni l'tumah could pass on to Chullin, the status of shlishi l'tumah? That's only when the tumah is doraisa. Over the Rabbanon lo. Now, in our Mishnah, we're dealing with Yadayim, and the Torah didn't say that Yadayim are Tmeos. The Rabbanan said Yadayim are Tmeos, and they have the status of Shnios. So who says that Rabbi Akiva would allow for transferring the Kiddush, the Tumah, over to Chullin from Shnios to make it into Shlishi L'Tumah? Wait, just one second. Something popped into my head. So why do we wash our hands for bread? That's a Xera to Truma. That has nothing to do with Chullin. Okay, I'm sorry. So again, the bottom line is we have to attribute our Mishnah to Rav Shimon ben Elazar, who says that if Yadayim went into a Beis Hamenuga, they become Rishonos, and therefore a Rishon L'Tumah can contaminate Chullin. If, again, it was Mukshel Kabel Tumah because the dam came out as a result of Shechita. A whole new interpretation of our Mishnah. Hacha, we're dealing with it, our Mishnah. Chullin Shenas Al Taras HaKodesh Askinon. Right, there were those who took upon themselves, and the Rabbanan actually institutionalized it, that they would treat Chullin the way they would treat Kodesh, with all the strictures of Kodesh. Because these were people who apparently, like Kohanim and others, who constantly were eating kachim, or maybe somebody who brings shlomim every mutak and darnished. So they wanted to make sure that they would get used to, guaranteeing that everything was tahar, and therefore even at Chullin they guaranteed it was tahar. That's called Nasu al Taras HaKodesh. And therefore, to the same extent that a sheni could be Metame Kodesh and make it into a shlishi, so too a sheni, meaning the hands that are shnios, could be Metame Chullin Shenasu al Taras HaKodesh, because we're going to treat it as if it were Truma or Kodesh. Udalok Rabbi Yeshua, but that's against Rabbi Yeshua. This time we learned in the Mishnah in Taros. We're going through half a Shas today. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Ha'ochel Rishon. Ochel Rishon Rishon. If he eats, as we said before, if you eat something that's Tomei, you become Tomei. So if you ate something that's a Rishon, like let's say something that fell into a Kli Cheres while the Sheretz was there, so forth, is you become a Rishon. Sheni, right? If you eat food that was a Sheni, let's say a food that was a rishon now came in contact with other food that made it into a sheni, and you went ahead and you ate that sheni, you become tummy as a sheni, and shlishi v'shlishi. Rabbi Yeshua Omer ochel rishon v'sheni. So if you eat a rishon, now the word v'sheni means o sheni or a sheni, then sheni. Now I'm not gonna accept that. Rabbi Elazar's chumrah that if you eat rishon, you become a rishon. No, no, no. If you eat rishon, you become a sheni. You eat sheni, you become a sheni. Shlishi, you become a sheni l'kodesh. Very fascinating. You ate something that was only a shlishi, and you become a sheni. If it was kodesh, I'm sorry, vis-a-vis kodesh, but ain't sheni l'truma. But if you ate shlishi, you don't become a sheni with regard to passing truma if you come in contact with the truma. Bechulin shenasu al taras truma. Oh, now there are two concepts. Until now, we've been talking about chulin shenasu al taras hakodesh. Now we have a new breakthrough concept called chulin shenasu al taras truma. And as far as that's concerned, Rabbi Yeshua is of the opinion that ain't sheni l'truma, altaris truma in, altaris hakodesh lo. He does not apply to chulin that which was prepared or accepted, I would say, as taras shel kodesh. Kasavar chulin shenasal taras hakodesh less behu shlishi. That even though you accepted upon yourself that you're going to treat your chulin as if it was kodesh, nevertheless, we're not going to go as far as to say that the chulin become shlishi. Rabbi Lazar, on the other hand, in that Mishnah was dealing with chulin, and it was prepared al taras hakodesh, implying that such chulin become a shlishi when it comes to contact with yadayim v'sovos, which are sheni, and that's against Rabbi Yoshua. Frek the Gemara v'lukma, and with this we'll conclude bechulin shenas al taras truma, which even Rabbi Yoshua agrees that in such a case he accepted that the chulin should be treated like kodesh, and therefore, I'm sorry, it should be treated like truma, and therefore there's a shlishi. And apparently, with regard to kodesh, it wasn't popular, so they didn't make any xeris. Lo salka daitach, we can't accept that. The ketani basar, there's no possibility of basar becoming truma. To eat betruma basar miika, elamai bekachim, and then we have the old kasha that we had before, chai bekachim miika. And the Gemara says, Basa b'basa michlef, Basa b'peri lo michlef, which Amir Hashem will pick up tomorrow at 9:30. Kein Yiratzon. This opportunity, wish you a great day, and thanks for participating.